Anyone who knows me well would probably tell you that one of my favorite things to read and study is true crime. Most people who are invested in this genre probably use air quotes when explaining who their favorite serial killer is. Mine is Aileen Wuornos. Recently, on a road trip through Port Orange, Florida, I knew I wanted to see some of the sites made famous not only by Aileen herself, but also the grossly inaccurate but emotionally compelling movie made about her 20 years ago called Monster. Aileen Wuornos' last known residence was at the time known as the Fairview Motel. She had broken up with her longtime girlfriend and left the motel shortly before her arrest in 1991 as she was behind on her rent and could not stay. The motel has since changed hands and has been rebranded as a motorcycle motel known as the Scoot Inn. Aileen's original room was numbered 8 or 9, depending on which source you believe. However, it is known which particular room belonged to her, and it has since been changed to room number 7. The reason for this change is the fact that the current property managers have moved into one of the rooms in the motel, necessitating rearranging of the room numbers to accommodate their living space. I pulled up to this motel on a whim without calling ahead. The owner's door was cracked open, and I knocked on it and asked if it would be possible for me to tour room number 7. The owner was extremely pleasant, and his first reaction to me was to ask if I was from the movies. I laughed, but I was flattered. He went inside to retrieve a key and told me to follow him to room number 7. He told me to look around and take my time, but I was as quick as I could be so as not to inconvenience him. It was absolutely surreal to be standing inside this room, knowing that Aileen herself had called it home, even if briefly, over 30 years ago. I was expecting to feel chills or perhaps creeped out, and I do know that multiple seances and attempts to communicate with the dead have been performed in this room, but I felt none of those things. I don't know if I have the right to have an opinion about Aileen, since I am in no way related to her victims or her crime spree, but she has always pulled on my heartstrings, and standing inside this room, I felt the pull even stronger. I do not believe she was a monster, and I have a huge amount of sympathy for the struggles she faced from her earliest childhood memories all the way through her adulthood. I will always believe that her experience shaped her into the person she became. What has always struck me in watching documentaries and interviews about her is her spectrum of personalities, from enraged and manic to calm, polite, and deferential. At times, she even had a killer sense of humor. There are times when I feel almost a connection to her, as if in a different time and place we could have been neighbors or even friends. She was, at the end of it all, a human being. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on Leap Year Day, February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her mother was only 14 years old when she married Aileen's father, who was 18. Her mother filed for divorce before Aileen was even born and gave birth to Aileen at the age of 16. Aileen never even met her father. He was later sentenced to life imprisonment for kidnapping and raping a 7-year-old girl. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and later committed suicide by hanging while in prison. Aileen was abandoned by her mother before she turned 4 years old. Her mother left her and her older brother in the care of their grandparents, who were both alcoholics. The children were legally adopted and their surnames were changed to Wuornos in 1960. There is speculation that her maternal grandfather may actually have been her biological father. By the age of 11, Aileen was engaging in sexual activities in school in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food, including with her own brother. Her alcoholic grandfather sexually assaulted and beat her. At 14, she became pregnant after being raped by a family friend. She gave birth to a boy at the home for unwed mothers, and the child was put up for adoption. Aileen dropped out of school shortly thereafter. Her grandfather then threw her out of the house, and she began living in the woods at the end of her street, supporting herself through prostitution at the young age of only 15. Aileen's criminal history began at the age of 18 when she was arrested for disorderly conduct, firing a pistol from a moving vehicle, and a DUI. She failed to appear in court, and 2 years later she hitchhiked to Florida. She met the president of a local yacht club who was over 50 years her senior, and quickly they were married. She was frequently involved in altercations at the local bars and went to jail for assault after hitting her elderly husband with his own cane. He filed a restraining order against her and had the marriage annulled within 9 weeks of the nuptials. She returned to Michigan, where she continued to have altercations with the law for assault and disturbing the peace. Aileen's brother passed away from esophageal cancer, and she was left with $10,000, which she squandered within 2 months, buying unnecessary luxuries, including a brand new car, which she promptly wrecked. Between the ages of 14 and 22, Aileen had attempted to take her own life at least 6 times. She was arrested multiple times in the early 1980s for theft, armed robbery, attempting to write forged checks, and resisting arrest. As you can tell, I was so stoked to have been able to visit this spot. It really meant a lot to me to be able to connect with her even in this simple little way. On January 9th, 1991, Aileen was arrested outside of this Port Orange biker bar known as The Last Resort on the pretext of an outstanding warrant under a false name. Police located Aileen's partner and girlfriend, Tyria, the following day in Pennsylvania and used her to elicit a confession from Wuornos in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Tyria made multiple phone calls to Aileen under police guidance, begging Aileen to help her clear her name of any crimes. 3 days later, Aileen confessed to murdering multiple men, claiming self-defense in all cases. On January 14, 1992, Aileen went on trial for the murder of Richard Charles Mallory. Richard was a 51-year-old electronics store owner. Aileen claimed that Mallory beat, raped, and sodomized her after driving her to an abandoned area. Richard was Aileen's first victim, and she maintained that she shot him in self-defense. Later, it became public knowledge that Richard had been previously convicted of attempted rape in Maryland and served time in a maximum security penitentiary. Evidence was also submitted that Richard possessed strong sociopathic tendencies, but the judge refused to allow this evidence in court and later denied Aileen's request for a retrial based on this information. Although previous convictions are normally inadmissible in criminal trials, the prosecution was allowed to introduce evidence related to Aileen's previous crimes in order to show a pattern of illegal activity. On January 27, 1992, Aileen was convicted of Richard Mallory's murder with the help of her own girlfriend's testimony. At her sentencing, psychiatrists for the defense testified that Aileen was mentally unstable and had been diagnosed with both borderline personality and antisocial personality disorders. However, she was sentenced to death only 4 days later. On March 31, 1992, Aileen pleaded no contest to the murders of Charles Humphreys, Troy Burgess, and David Spears, saying that she wanted to get right with God. In her statement in court, she said that Richard Mallory did violently rape her, as she had previously testified, but that these other men only started to attack her. This was a story she changed multiple times in interviews over the subsequent years. On May 15, 1992, Aileen was given 3 more consecutive death sentences. In June of 1992, Aileen pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Carskadden. In November of that year, she received her 5th death sentence. In February 1993, Aileen pleaded guilty to the murder of Walter Antonio and was sentenced to death yet again. No charges were brought against her for the presumed murder of Peter Sims, as his body was never found. In total, Aileen received 6 death sentences. Over the years, Aileen told several inconsistent stories about the killings. She initially claimed that all 7 men had either raped or attempted to rape her while she was working as a prostitute. Later, she recanted the claim of self-defense, claiming that her motive was robbery with a desire to leave no witnesses. After being on death row for 10 years, Aileen granted an interview to filmmaker Nick Broomfield. After the interview was over and thinking that the cameras were turned off, Aileen very candidly and apparently honestly told Nick that all 7 murders were in fact committed in self-defense, but that she could not stand being on death row any longer and simply wanted to die. Aileen Wuornos was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections Broward Institution on their death row for women. Later, she was transferred to the Florida State Prison for execution. Her appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied in 1996. In a 2001 petition to the Florida Supreme Court, she changed her story yet again and stated that her intention was to kill all of these men as cold as ice and threatened to do it again if she were not executed. She declared her competency and sanity and stated that she was trying to tell the truth. Her attorneys argued that she was clearly not mentally competent to make such a request, but Aileen insisted that she knew what she was doing. A court-appointed panel of psychiatrists agreed, and her conviction was not overturned. In 2002, Aileen began accusing prison employees of tainting her food with dirt, saliva, and urine. She claimed she had overheard conversations among them trying to get her pushed over the brink to commit suicide before her execution and wishing to harm her before her execution. She also complained of strip searches, tight handcuffing, door kicking, frequent window checks, low water pressure, mildew on her mattress, and distasteful catcalling. Aileen threatened to boycott showers and food when certain officers were on duty. Her attorneys argued for more humane treatment, stating that Aileen simply wanted to be treated like a human being until the day she was executed. She went through her execution still believing that the prison personnel were conspiring to harm her. In the weeks before her execution, Aileen gave a series of interviews and talked frequently about being taken away to meet God and Jesus and the angels and whatever else is beyond the beyond. In her final interview, she continued to complain of being tortured at the correctional institution, claiming that her head was being crushed by a sonic pressure. Food poisoning and other abuses worsened every time she complained, with the goal of making her appear to be insane or to drive her insane. She also maintained that the prison personnel were conspiring in Hollywood to elicit a good story from her time spent on death row and make their money after she was executed. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. She declined her last meal and opted for a cup of coffee instead. Her last words were, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." She died at 9:47 in the morning. She was the second woman in Florida and the 10th woman in the United States to be executed. After her death, Aileen's body was cremated and her ashes were scattered underneath a tree in her native Michigan by a childhood friend. At her request, Natalie Merchant's song Carnival from her album Tiger Lily was played at her funeral. When Natalie found out about this, she gave permission for the song to be used in a documentary. She said that she was so disturbed by the subject matter of the documentary she could not even watch it. Aileen Wuornos led a torturing life that it was beyond my worst nightmares. It is very odd to think of the places my music can go once it leaves my hands. If it gave her some solace, I have to be grateful. And that wraps up the footage that I was able to take at the Last Resort Bar. I hope you enjoyed seeing this, knowing that it was the last place that Aileen Wuornos walked around as a free woman and enjoyed her last beer. I'd like to do more videos on Aileen Wuornos related sites here in Florida, and she will always be my #1 favorite serial killer.